here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. After days of uncertainty, the projections by key media in the U.S. give the Democratic candidate and former Vice President Joe Biden the electoral votes he needs to secure the White House. A victory in the key northeastern state of Pennsylvania took him over the magic number of 270 electoral college votes. As Biden continues to receive congratulations from world leaders, President Donald Trump has yet to concede the race. So will this be the start of what Biden has declared the time to heal in America? And what major changes can we expect in U.S. foreign policy once Biden takes office? Let's loop in our panelists. For the latest development about the U.S. election, I'm joined in Chicago by Laura Schwartz, a political commentator who has worked at the White House during the Clinton years. In Iowa City, Timothy Hagel, professor of political science from University of Iowa, and also in Washington, D.C., Bruce Fein, former Associate Deputy Attorney General and General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission under President Reagan. Wonderful to see the three of you. Let me start by asking all of you, who could tell me how far are we from a confirmed President of the United States of America?
Under federal statute, December 8th is the date designated when secretaries of state will certify the winners in their particular jurisdictions.
Okay.
On December 14th, the state electors meet in their separate jurisdictions to actually cast their votes. On January 6th, the joint session of Congress counts the votes, and that probably will be the date when there'll be finally and authoritatively and constitutionally end the game for Mr. Trump. But those are the deadlines that we confront moving forward.
Given that the U.S. politics has been quite nuanced over the past few years, Professor Hagel, how confident can we be about these deadlines?
Well, it doesn't look like we're going to have a situation like we had in Florida back in the 2000 election where there are recount issues. That said, we do have those lawsuits, and even if they don't seem to be particularly going to be particularly successful at this point, they are going to need to go through the process. And so if the process is sped along fairly quickly, then we should be able to meet those deadlines. But if there are any hiccups along the way, then it's possible that could get pushed back a little bit. But on the other hand, what we saw again in 2000 was that the Supreme Court was willing to step in and make sure that we did meet those deadlines.
Supreme Court, of course, is an interesting issue, isn't it, Ms. Schwartz, given the makeup of the Supreme Court right now?
When you look at the Bush-Gore recount in the year 2000, it was within 500 votes in the state of Florida. And it was based on evidence. There was a recount. The Supreme Court made a decision, and George Bush was the victor. Gore conceded the next day before that electoral college met. Now, those are the deadlines and the timelines laid forth. But what we didn't talk about yet is the fact that when there is a new president chosen, a president-elect, and for all intents and purposes, especially with the mathematical challenge and the winning of the state of Pennsylvania for the electoral college for Joe Biden, of which he's up more than 49,000 votes, and as was mentioned by Mr. Fein, none of the legal cases so far are sticking with any evidence. That's when the General Services Administration, the General Services Administrator who takes care of that, who's a political appointee by Donald Trump, is able to ascertain the election that Joe Biden is indeed the president-elect.
Professor Hagel, now, according to media reports, certainly the one around the President Trump has been talking to him about the issue of conceding. We haven't seen any gesture in that direction, though. The lawyers are already quite busy, no matter whether the lawsuits really make sense or not. But Professor Hagel, tell me about some of the legal issues that we are facing right now.
Well, basically, there's a question of what you might call voting irregularities. That's not necessarily fraud, although fraud has been alleged. We're waiting to see some hard evidence of that. We have some anecdotal evidence of various people in various states, Pennsylvania and elsewhere. that are suggesting that maybe something inappropriate happened. So call that irregularities. That needs to be investigated. But the problem for the Trump administration right now is that even if some irregularities did occur, and they're always going to occur, we hope that the difference between the candidates is large enough that those irregularities aren't going to make a difference. They did in Florida in 2000. It doesn't so far appear that they're going to this time, but they still have to work themselves out. And so until they do, it's understandable, I suppose, especially given Trump's reputation as a fighter, that he's not willing to concede. But I think that there will be people around him that as we get closer and closer to some of those deadlines, that they will begin to tell him, okay, it's time to pack it in.
Yeah. Besides his campaign team, Mr. Fine, it seems that most of the Republican Party has remained somewhat silent or muted about the issue. That's a very interesting situation.
Well, it is, and it's certainly partially explainable by the fact that, unlike Trump, the Republican Party in the House and Senate races did better than was expected. The Republicans gained seats in the House, maybe as many as a half a dozen or more. In the Senate, it was thought that they had, I think, 11 or 12 seats up, and they might lose the Senate. That apparently is not going to be the case unless the Georgia double senatorial elections go Democratic, which would be unusual. So it's very difficult for Trump to make the case that there was systematic bias against Republicans in the vote counting when their congressional and senatorial candidates did better than expected. Now, with regard to the legal issue you mentioned, the most important, I think, constitutional question that was confronted in sideways in Bush v. Gore is whether or not the voting rules that are binding on Election Day are to be prescribed by the state legislature, as the Constitution directs in Article 2, or whether you could have the courts in a state embellish, modify the state legislative action and add days, as was done in Pennsylvania, 3 days, to the time when you could receive a mailed-in ballot and have it still count. The problem with Mr. Trump, even on that score, is that in Pennsylvania, the number of votes that came in during the 3-day window is a fraction of Mr. Biden's victory. Otherwise, the kinds of claims they're making, they didn't permit our poll watchers to become, look over the shoulders of the vote counters. They permitted illegal ballots to be stored near legal ballots. They still haven't amounted to proof that a single illegal vote was counted. And I think we are accustomed to having Mr. Trump and his supporters like Mr. Giuliani, who I knew at the Department of Justice, who's not been a court of law for 45 years, say, well, there was fraud. But in the court of law, you actually have evidence under oath. You need direct testimony.
Right.
And at present, there hasn't been any testimony of that sort showing even the irregularities that Mr. Hagel reported have been at all, in any event, biased in favor of Biden. Irregularities don't have any political affiliation.
Mr. Schwartz, about the media, from no matter earlier where they were supporting in terms of political parties, they seem to have a rather united voice in terms of what they believe should be the president-elect. How do you make of the latest development in this regard?
Well, interesting, because the decision desks at all of the networks and the Associated Press, they don't collect information, they don't base their winner for the state on exit polling or anything of the sort. They take the actual concrete information that the state is releasing with full transparency. And then it's a matter of math. And even Fox News Channel, the night of the election, called the race for Arizona, which greatly upset Donald Trump and the Trump campaign, that resulted with calls over Fox News Channel to say, take it back. And they did not, because numbers are numbers.
I know these days things are all about scenarios and how to find solutions to various scenarios. New scenarios popping up, as you just illustrated. Yet there's another extreme scenario that the person that's right now in the White House reluctant to go. So what would be the legal structure if that were the case? And an official president-elect has been announced through legal means.
If Mr. Trump attempted to remain in the White House after Mr. Biden is inaugurated and sworn in by the Chief Justice of the United States, he would be probably punished for criminal trespass. I do not think that the military, the Secret Service, anyone else who would have access to force would defend in these circumstances.
Professor Hagel, do you see it also that way?
I do, although hopefully it won't come to that. I'm normally not overly optimistic about these things, but I would think that before it came to that, any kind of thing where you have to physically oust President Trump to get him out of the White House, that Republicans and perhaps even his strongest supporters in Congress would come to him and basically explain the situation and hopefully get him to understand that it's time to go. This is essentially what happened to Richard Nixon back in the day in the 70s. Republicans finally came to him and said, look, it's time to go. You're creating a constitutional crisis, and basically he gave in. Trump hopefully would do the same thing, that at some point you would realize that his efforts at this point are futile, and again, hopefully the Supreme Court or other lower courts would have made that decision pretty clear as well.
Let's talk about the two political potential for these two gentlemen. One is the current president. The other, of course, could be the new president. Well, we are not having editorial policies declaring one or the other. But for President Trump, it's a very interesting situation that after the result of the election comes out, there is very little partisan support for him within the Republican Party in terms of his claim that the election has been fraud and this and that. Yet, he has managed to, some suggest, get two Chief Justice into the Supreme Court. And also, he has managed to a certain extent, look at the House votes, the Republican Party having more members in the House of Representatives, and likely also to remain majority, if not something happened in the Senate. So, and he's been using his executive power to do a lot of things that most of the Republican Party members, particularly those in the office, are reluctant to do and put it on their own track record. So how should we see this person and his relation with his party?
It's certainly a complex one, as you basically laid out there. And to some extent, you start talking about, well, what will his legacy be? And right now, and during his presidency, it's been very difficult for a lot of people other than Republicans to say, well, what things has Trump accomplished? There was such an anti-Trump attitude on a number of fronts that it was hard for anybody really to say, okay, these are the good things. Now, Trump, of course, would trumpet his own good things, and Republicans would mention that as well. That was certainly some of the issues that were central to the current campaign. But Trump also had problems in terms of stepping on his successes, in terms of his style. And so I think people, even a lot of Republicans, will not miss that particularly. And maybe in time, people can look back and say, well, there were things that were good in terms of recovery after the lockdowns of the economy, or at least the stock market and some related fields, trying to get past that. Like you say, the increase in the Republicans in the House, at least in this last time, maintaining control of the Senate. So those are good things for the party. But how the party reacts to Trump afterwards, to some extent, is going to depend on what happens now. If Trump fights his way to the very end and basically causes burning of bridges behind him, so to speak, that's not going to go well for his overall legacy in terms of the party.
Ms. Schwartz, what about for Mr. Biden? Now, even if eventually he would be declared as the president-elect, he is going to face quite a tough job ahead, particularly with what's happening in the House of Representatives, more Republican members, and then in the Senate likely to maintain the control by the Republican Party. So he's going to be a lame duck in a way. Is he going to follow Trump's process of using executive order to do all the things, or what's going to be the path for him and the potential for him?
Well, I wouldn't write him off as a lame duck just yet. I think when we look at his record with Mitch McConnell and Biden and Obama's administration getting things passed on the Hill with a Republican Senate, I do believe that there will be victories that he can share with Republicans, because that's how he's governed before, and we have no indication that he would govern any differently as a president of the United States. And so I see him working with the majority of Democrats in the House, as well as the very slim majority of the Republicans in the Senate, so that they can all get wins, especially as we approach dealing with the global pandemic, the economy, and other important priorities that we saw people, both Republicans and Democrats, want to be attacked and looked at from the very start.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Fine. One of the things the Supreme Court is likely to look at is the health care issue that President Obama has been using his executive order to achieve. Now, if Mr. Biden comes into the office as the president-elect, he's likely to face a very interesting situation to begin with, not to mention the pandemic, the economy, and many other things. Just politically, it's going to be a very interesting situation.
Let me just correct
Please.
One statement.
Yeah.
President Obama passed the Affordable Care Act through Congress. It wasn't an executive order.
Okay.
The issue that is now presenting itself before the U.S. Supreme Court, in fact, it's argued this week, is whether or not the repeal of the penalty for declining to get health insurance with certain coverage makes the entire Affordable Care Act unconstitutional.
Thank you.
Or whether you can sever that one provision from the remainder of the act. And provisions, for example, prohibiting denial based on pre-existing conditions and setting ceilings on the amount of insurance to be paid for mental health care, things like that, will stay. I have read the cases thoroughly. I do not think the court is going to hold the Affordable Care Act unconstitutional in its entirety. I think there's consensus in Congress, given the swell of support of the American people for these other provisions, that a successor statute would pass relatively swiftly.
Thank you for your correction and a very resourceful answer, sir. Having said that, though, another question for all of you. We've seen the European counterparts of the United States have been expressing their attitude since most of the media organizations have declared that Mr. Biden might be the president-elect. It's a very interesting picture. Well, the incumbent president is suggesting there is fraud in the election. So how do you see this interesting attitude coming from the international community? Of course, this is only about your European counterpart. There are others who have not spoken out yet. How do you see this very interesting picture regarding who's the U.S. president and how the others are looking at this issue? Professor Hagel, as a political scientist, professor, I'm sure you have your views.
Foreign leaders are often in a difficult situation if you're going to have a contested election like this. But they, like people in the United States, can take a look at the numbers. As Ms. Schwartz was saying, that's what it is. It's numbers, how many are outstanding, what's the evidence, and so forth. And at a certain point, they don't want to, not that they necessarily would, but they don't want to get on the bad side necessarily of Mr. Biden, in the sense that if they wait too long, then maybe he feels hurt to some extent, and perhaps many countries, for the leaders in particular, that were not keen on Mr. President Trump's style, are maybe happy to see him go, and so are eager to welcome a new president in. And so you've got to play that game a little bit too, and especially if they think that Trump will be exiting the White House, maybe they feel sufficiently safe, and it's a good time for them to go ahead and welcome what they believe will be the new president-elect.
Ms. Schwartz.
Yes, and to build on the professor, even Trump's friend from India, the Prime Minister Modi of India, opened his arms to Joe Biden, as well as Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. And I think that has really taken a toll on Donald Trump, because you could see his Twitter feed just explode as foreign leaders started congratulating and reaching out to President-elect Biden. You know, the moment Donald Trump feels irrelevant is when he really ratchets up his attacks, and that's what we're seeing. So you can tell it does not sit well with him currently. He still is president, you know, until January 20th, right, and has to work with these leaders. But he does refuse to accept, and we'll let these legal challenges go forward. Of course, we're a great democracy. but then he will have to accept results at some point. I don't think he'll concede or ever admit, but he'll have to accept it in the way of leaving.
My last question, also many are curious from around the world whether there would be extreme actions or rhetorics coming from the current president of the United States toward the rest of the world, or any part, a specific part of the rest of the world. Who is going to rein him in? Is the system going to function? We've seen most of the important members of his administration, the Secretary of Defense, for example, has already resigned. So at this point, during this transition, are we going to see bigger danger in terms of how a president governs the country and also facing up to foreign policy issues? Mr. Fine.
Well, I think there surely is a risk. The Secretary of Defense was fired. He didn't resign. In fact, he was asked to resign earlier and declined to do so, and Trump sent out signals that he was going to fire him if he won a second term. And there have been some leaks from the New York Times that Mr. Trump may be contemplating a nuclear strike against Iran, which surely would be very, very dangerous to the whole world to have a nuclear conflagration. Mr. Trump is an erratic individual. He's exceptionally narcissistic, and who knows what he would do. When we had a similar situation in Watergate, when President Nixon was rather imbalanced in the waning days of his impeachment ordeal, then Secretary of Defense Schlesinger ordered the troops not to obey a presidential order to attack unless it came and was ratified by the Secretary of Defense. And it is an action of the military to disobey a clearly illegal order. And I think that's what may happen if Trump went to that bold, audacious step. I'm mildly optimistic that he will refrain from doing something so reckless, because he does have the possibility of a life after the White House. But it's very difficult to say, given the erratic behavior of someone who at one time recommended swallowing Clorox to solve the COVID-19 pandemic.
Ms. Schwartz, same question.
Well, I agree with Mr. Fine. There's a lot that can be done over 70-some odd days. But I, too, have a faith in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, our members of the military, and career governmental employees and foreign service officers, that they would not let this happen. And I can only hope, though I remain disappointed, that more Republicans of Donald Trump's own party don't have a sit-down with him. I truly believe the way to get Donald Trump to calm down and serve out the rest of his term will be members of his family coming to him. And we know it's not going to be Donald Trump Jr. or Eric Trump, but perhaps a Jared Kushner or Ivanka, his daughter, to say, let's think about life after the White House, your brand, your legacy, if you want to run again in 2024. Donald Trump cares greatly about his brand and net worth. That is something I think he would preserve over going off the handle in the next 70 days. If he knew that was hanging in the balance, he would choose his brand over the United States.
Fortunately, I guess, or maybe unfortunately, Ms. Schwartz stole exactly what I was going to say, which is that you have to look at the brand, and Mr. Fine indicated that Trump will be thinking about, and perhaps people will tell him about, that there's life after the White House, and perhaps people have speculated maybe Donald Trump would run again in 2024, maybe Don Jr. would run in 2024, and if basically Donald Trump burns his bridges behind him on his way out, that's going to ruin that, plus whatever, even if neither one of them run for politics again, they have their commercial brands to worry about. And so I think that would probably be the convincing argument to make for Donald Trump to leave fairly soon after everybody realizes that the legal cases aren't going to go anywhere.
Thank you so much for the three of you helping us to understand much better about what's going on from outside the country. Given the pandemic, it's very hard to travel to different parts of the world. Laura Schwartz, Timothy Hagel, Bruce Fine, really appreciate it. It's a political drama right in front of everybody's eyes in the world. Really appreciate it for your insights.